Good morning. Hope you guys are doing well. Today we're going to talk about the importance of being earnest. This is sort of an introductory presentation to prepare you to think more about Victorian culture and morals and read Oscar Wilde's satire, The Importance of Being Earnest, his last and considered his best play. This will be Importance of Being Earnest. I've got a PDF version up on the website when you're ready to start reading. It also has a little bit of an introductory material that you'll read there. And of course, the assignments are on Canvas if you have any question about that. So we're going to talk a bit about Victorian society today, looking at marriage, families, social class, Oscar Wilde himself, the morals, the idea behind social satire, which you've got a little introduction to with The Modest Proposal, and how these ideas of paradoxes and social satire affect the importance of being earnest. So Victorian society, as we've talked about, as much of British culture before, placed the father at the head of the household. He was a figure of respect, and like we've already talked about, the gender roles were very rigidly set. Wives had the domestic duties, though upper-class households also had servants, maids, to do the bulk of the work, while the woman might be in charge of planning, that sort of thing. And family was seen as being very important. It identified who you were in society based on who your family was, how many servants you had, that sort of stuff. And marriages were still very economically based at this time as well. And of course, as we saw, a lot of laws pretty much favored men over women. So the upper class, like kings, like the monarchy before them, or along with them, saw themselves as class rulers because of a divine right. They're supposed to be in charge. They have the family pedigree and heritage and the money. Yet at the same time, the middle class was beginning to compete with the landed gentry. And the landed gentry just means those people who owned large tracts of land that were worked by the poor that provided their incomes. And with the rise of industrialism, we saw the rise of the nouveau riche, which is new rich people, right? And materialism, and the upper class lost money to this new middle class that was being developed. And we start to see more mixing between upper and middle class, though certainly the upper class saw themselves as superior still. You don't want to mix, they didn't want to mix with the middle class, but what you're going to do if you don't have any money? A lot of literature at this time across the European continent you have a lot of characters who may have aristocratic titles, but don't really have much money anymore. So in kind of becoming the middle class, people who rose from the lower classes tended to adopt a strict sense of moral virtue. So whereas there might be some flexibility with the upper classes, the middle class seeking to sort of solidify themselves and seem important or necessary wanted to adopt strict moral guidelines. So the nation sort of got these ideas from Queen Victoria, who we'll hear more about during your poster presentations. She had like we've talked about before, she was seen as the paragon of feminine virtue. She had a strict code of morals. People who were who held religious office were also finding positions in the government. Yet, despite these strict moral codes, there was still some sort of open sexuality happening beneath the surface. So while it wasn't discussed in public, there were certainly still there was prostitution, and a lot of literature still talked about it in code, right, in metaphors. Yet, as we saw, homosexuality was still very much illegal. So paradox. Paradox is when two opposite claims in the same statement, they seem like they shouldn't make sense, but they do. They reveal a hidden truth of sorts. And then hypocrisy is many individuals trying to maintain a moral life, still being tempted, still giving into this temptation for the things that they enjoyed, whether it was drugs or liquor or sex. They sort of had to lead two lives. They were hypocrites, right? They might preach and act one way, and yet below the surface, they were doing something oppositional. So some people lived these lives of paradox. Their lives were contradictions. They were above ground, very seemingly moral and upright, but below the surface had vices going on. That was I think, what stands out in Victorian society the most. So Oscar Wilde, his life was very much like a play. He was born in 1864. He died in 1900, so he was pretty young, but right in the heart of Victorianism, especially high Victorianism, late Victorianism, which started to see some changing of attitudes and whatnot. He went to Dublin. He went to Oxford. He was a classicist, meaning that he had read and respected and knew a lot about classic literature, and he was very interested in studies of old civilizations as well. He really ascribed to a Hellenic ideal, that is, ancient Greek, as being sort of a pinnacle of culture. And unsurprisingly, also there was, open homosexuality, and the arts and everything was very strong, very different from Victorian culture at the time. And this led him to another passion, which is this idea of aestheticism. And aestheticism is living life as though it's art, or a real focus on the artistic qualities around us in life. And he was very kind of flamboyant in his clothing and manner. He looked almost like, he would be in a painting or something like that, and believed in art for art's sake. Not that art needs to serve a purpose, not that it should teach us or moralize to us, but rather that it should give us pleasure and delight just to look at it, just to read it, just to hear it. That's the purpose of art as he saw it, not to teach us something. So this is very different again from the realistic prose, the realistic novels being written at the time as well, who sought to capture life in all its details and reality. Instead, which might not be beautiful, but Wilde saw art as a necessity to focus on beauty. And that took some interesting forms in his satirical plays. He also wrote a novel called The Picture of Dorian Gray, about a man who has a portrait of himself locked away, and he is able to sin and give in to vice as much as he wants, and it only affects the look of his portrait, which degrades day by day. Very good novel if you're interested. So he also, because he was interested in art for art's sake, he also took a view of that towards life. Right here we have a painting of this looks like the Louvre. I'm not 100% sure. This looks like the Louvre in Paris to me. But, he saw society and life deserve the same ideas as art. So that kind of leads us to the idea of hedonism, which is living in full the pleasures of life, right? Enjoying all the pleasures of life. Living for pleasure is a virtue. And you see some of this again with the ancient Greeks as well. And of course, this is in opposition to Victorian views of morality that saw family and stability, money as the important things in life. Now, of course, to live for pleasure, you have to have money, right? You don't get to live for pleasure if you're poor. But Wilde saw this, instead of reinforcing these very moralistic views of life and virtues and living sinfully under the surface, he saw instead that life should just be open in that way. We should embrace the hedonism of life. So he had a very successful life. He visited America, he lectured, he married and had children. He was a very successful writer and playwright. He wrote a lot of plays. I'm trying to remember now. Salome is one. Lady Windermere's Fan. But his most famous and most important was The Importance of Being Earnest. And his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, also very famous. But he was also very notorious in social circles. I think he has a very cutting sense of humor. There's a good movie about him called Wild from the 90s, if you're interested in seeing that as well. Lived a very interesting life. Yet he actually, he had a lot going on in his own life, his own personal life. He sued for libel, right, against charges of homosexuality in Wilde v. Queensberry, but actually through his own lawsuit, the court turned around and tried him criminally for homosexuality, and he was found guilty. He did, you can see here an example from a paper, right, about Oscar Wilde's downfall. He defended himself very eloquently. He was very good in court, and his trials were a public spectacle. He was, in a sense, I think, in defending himself, also trying society for its hypocrisy. But there was a lot of evidence against him. And in fact, they used his novel, A Picture of Dorian Gray, as evidence against him in the trial. And he was sentenced to prison for sodomy, acts of a gross, indecent nature. So he was sentenced to 2 years prison with hard labor. When he was released, he left and went to France, and he died shortly thereafter. So not a very, not a very happy, positive ending for Oscar Wilde, but he left a lot of good writing behind. So though Wilde was a part of the society of Victorian society, of upper Victorian society, he also satirizes it endlessly. He is really focused on social satire, so ironic observations about society. He criticizes with humor and wit, right? Instead of, again, writing these polemical writings against society and its hypocrisy, he chooses to use it to use what's there against society itself through humor. So as you read The Importance of Being Earnest, understand that the people who were reading this wouldn't laugh at it, or the people the people in the play don't see don't see the humor of what they're saying, right? Or the seeming ironies, the paradoxes, the hypocrisy. The audience would, right? But the people in the play are being serious in a sense. So as we read it, where are Ernest's, what are the observations about society? What is Wilde trying to say about Victorian society at the time? So The Importance of Being Earnest, it's a social satire. It tends to make the serious ridiculed and the ridiculous taken seriously. It's that sort of switch, turning things on its head. And there's many paradoxical and ironic situations and lines. I mean, really, it's, a mile a minute here. There's a lot going on as you read, and you have to read it carefully. And it exposes hypocrisy by blatantly showing it in the play. Again, the audience would see the humor in this, but the people involved in the play, the characters, don't. Just like when we read Othello, we see what Iago is doing. We understand what's happening behind the scenes, but the characters in the play don't. They're kind of hapless to it. So think about, as you read The Importance of Being Earnest, as you start to read that, are we ourselves in an age of contradiction, right? We have scandals in public. I mean, we always do, yet our media seems to profit by it. And sometimes we have to ask, do people pay a price for the scandals? And what do you think about Victorian culture? Is it comparable to our culture now? Do we live more in an age of open hedonism? Or do we live under this sort of idea of morality? That might be an interesting question to think about as well. So part of your assignment to do is to take one of the quotes that are posted on Canvas from Oscar Wilde. He has got books of his wit and wisdom published. Pick one of the ones I posted there for you, and I'd like you to write, I think I said, 250, 300 words, something like that, about the quote, right? What does it suggest to you? What does it mean to you? What do you think Oscar Wilde meant it to mean? All right, so that's the end. Hopefully you found this informative as you begin to read Oscar Wilde's play. Hopefully we will be back in class after spring break in order to finish reading the play and talking about it together. In the meantime, take care.